I'd like to start my sermon by telling you about a saint. Her name was Elaine Ho. I know that many of you knew Elaine. She died about 4.5 years ago and was a pillar of the church. And I know that all of you who knew her would not disagree with me calling her a saint. Last week at the coffee hour time at the 10:30 service on the Sunday after All Saints, Pat Dare shared about how he and Clarabelle came to the church, St. Thomas. And as I recall, Pat and Clarabelle were trying not to get too involved and maybe, not be asked to do too many things. And so they wanted to keep a low profile. And the first person they met was Elaine Ho. And instead of asking them to do stuff, which was what they were concerned about, Elaine always asked what she could do for them. And that won over Pat and Clarabelle, and now they are here doing way too much stuff. So anyone who knew Elaine and came close to her always felt that she really cared about them, without judgment. And I think many people loved being around her because she listened so well, and she really became their advocate. But she was aware that this didn't always mean that everyone understood that she had her own mind too. When Elaine was close to death, about 2 days before she died, I went to visit Elaine. And, at that time, I didn't really think that Elaine was close to death because she had a fall, but she looked perky. And so when I was talking with her, she said something kind of strange. She just started talking about, well, when I die, and I'm like, you just had a fall, and she's like, no, I want to tell you something. When I die, people are going to say all kinds of things about me to stop the church from changing. They will say things like, oh, Elaine wouldn't want that, or Elaine wouldn't do this, so that they can prevent change from coming. And they will say that the change would dishonor me. But I want you to know from me directly that I want you to do whatever you need to do to lead this church, to take it into the future. I do not have a problem with change. And in fact, Elaine would go through her ultimate change in 2 days, where she shrugged off the perishable to reveal what is imperishable. This conversation with Elaine was very important to me. I felt Elaine blessed me that day. But it was a blessing not like, a soft and warm, fuzzy feeling. I think she could see that the road before me was rugged and that she was commissioning me, ordaining me to go forth in leading the church. And I knew it would require all my courage and love to navigate. And I didn't know how to see where things would go. And she didn't know either, but she wanted me to try. Today in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, Jesus is actually having a similar kind of conversation with his disciples. There's going to be 2 deaths, actually. After chapter 13, Jesus is going to start the passion. That is, the suffering he's going to have as he's moving toward crucifixion. This is a pivoting point in the Gospel of Mark. But there's another death also, and that is the death of the temple. And today we hear that the disciples are walking through the temple court, and they are looking up at the stones and all the great buildings that sit in the temple court, and they are just so impressed. They're like, look, Jesus, look at the big stones and all these big buildings. And I think Jesus must have been sad when he needed to tell them the truth. He said, you know, you like these buildings and these stones, you think they're so big. I have some bad news for you. They're all going to come down. Not one stone will be left in place. Jesus is not talking metaphorically today about the destruction of the temple. It was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. And in fact, the Gospel of Mark was written right after the destruction of the Second Temple as a meditation on what it means to be followers of Jesus without the temple, without this edifice that they're so used to dictating how spirituality was engaged. So in the year 66, it was the first Roman-Jewish war, and the Jews had become fed up with Roman oppression, and they were rebelling. But it wasn't going to go well for the Jews. The Roman army and legions, they were so strong. So they laid siege, the Romans laid siege on Jerusalem and surrounded it and essentially starved out Jerusalem. And they destroyed the temple. The assault of the first Jewish-Roman war was so horrific that it stayed in the minds of the Jews for many, many years. And its images of not just plunder and murder and assault, but starvation and cannibalism, all happening because they were just surrounded. So at the end of this first Jewish-Roman war, the temple was destroyed. And not one, there is one wall that is left, but for the most part, not one stone was left upon the other. Of course, after this, the oppression of Rome did not waver. And so the Jews continued to rebel in a series of wars called the Jewish-Roman Wars. And these wars lasted till the year 135. And by then, the Jews went from being a major population in the Eastern Mediterranean to becoming a scattered and persecuted minority. And the Gospel of Mark was written in the crucible of this chaos. So back to the scene that we have today in the Gospel of Mark on the Mount of Olives after they have walked through the temple court. Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked Jesus, so when will the chaos be over? That is, when will it all be accomplished? What sign are we supposed to look for that it's all done? In other words, can you tell us when it's going to be over so we don't have to think about what happens in between? Before the real chaos even begins, the disciples want to know how it will be over, when it will all be accomplished. It's hard to think about all the suffering in between. You just want to know the end of the story. And Jesus tells them, you got to stick with the suffering. He says that, many will come in my name and they'll say, I am he, even. They will claim to be me. And they'll want to say, you don't have to think about this hard stuff. It's all done. It's all accomplished. I'm back. The second coming is here. But he says, don't believe them. Don't be led astray. The chaos won't be over. In fact, there will be wars, rumors of wars, famine, earthquakes. When you see all this, it's only the beginning. It is the birth pangs. If you're looking for a gospel that helps you feel safe and secure at night so you can just go to sleep, do not read the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is a difficult gospel. It is called the Gospel of the Cross. Out of the gate, in the Gospel of Mark, it has no time for a nativity story, no time for angels and sheep and shepherds so that one day we can have a Christmas pageant for children to play in. No. Right out of the gate, Jesus is set on the way. And this way leads to the passion, to the cross. It is a cruciform way. It is in the shape of the cross. But not only this, everyone who follows Jesus on this way, on this path of discipleship, also follows a cruciform way. He said in his first prediction, all who follow me must pick up their own cross. And the Gospel of Mark is also very interesting in that when it ends without a resurrection scene. It's just an empty tomb with the women afraid, telling no one, walking away in silence. It is not a gospel of warm fuzzies. But it's been the perfect gospel for the year 2020 and 2021. I'm of course thinking of the pandemic, now that death has made a long visit on our earth. But I'm also thinking about other things we are contending with in these last 2 years. The global reckoning for our abuse of God's creation. Look at the historic fires. Year after year, we've been having historic fires and historic hurricanes. These are now in the superlatives, the hottest, the biggest, the most devastating disasters. And in the midst of this, we are also reckoning as a country with the reality of racism, our history of racism, our inheritance, and how it perpetuates in our systems. The list goes on. It has been chaotic. The good news, and yes, there's always good news because it's a gospel. The good news is that these are the birth pangs. It's not a warm, fuzzy kind of good news. It's the kind of good news that requires work to make it good news. The laboring in the birth pangs. Because what happens with birth pangs, the labor of it, is that there's new life. There's new life at the end of the birth pangs. But you have to go through the labor, you have to go through the pain. And it has been a year where we could be honest about the ways we are connected, the ways we are disconnected. And yes, the answers might not be easy, but the work is obvious. If we are honest, the work must be done to face climate change and our history of racism. And it requires our best grieving and our most honest look. And if we accept these opportunities around us, then we can move toward a new vision, move toward healing. And even at the end of the gospel, when we are left with the empty tomb, what I sense there is that it is the birth pangs pushing out new life. The tomb is like the womb of God that has just birthed something new. But of course, it takes time to know what that is. It takes silence. And so it's okay to be quiet in these days when we look around and try and perceive new life emerging out of the tomb and out of the womb. To take time to be silent, to ponder and to wonder before we so quickly move to fix it, because the old ways just might not work anymore for a new dispensation, new life. There are no easy answers in the path of discipleship that is in the shape of the cross. We're called and blessed, but it's a lot like the English word for blessed, meaning to be bloodied, to be sprinkled with blood. It's not a warm consolation, but it is the birth pangs, which offer us both labor and new life, all of which we do by the motivation of love. For without love, there's no virtue. There is only apparent virtue. So let us breathe together as a church. Let us take time to ponder and consider how to move forward into things we don't really understand. And let us be brave and faithful and loving. And most of all, in this love, let us do it together. For this is church. This is a gathering. And so we walk together on this cruciform way in birth pangs because we desire to see the new life God is making.